Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for, is it our first back in person?
I think so.
It's our second, first our semester.
It's, here we are. All together. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Zachary DuBois to our SHESC Colloquium. He is an assistant professor with the packet headed in for promotion, hopefully, in 10 years soon, in the Department of Anthropology at University of Oregon. Go Ducks. He's a biocultural anthropologist whose work draws on both qualitative and quantitative methods to ask questions at the intersection of biology and culture. Dr. DuBois' interests are in the social determinants of health, as well as understanding how humans adapt and remain resilient in the face of dynamic environmental and bodily changes. His work focuses on marginalized communities at risk of social stress. Specifically, he asks how stress, resilience, and other social determinants of health are embodied, literally getting under the skin. His prior work includes the Transition Experience Study, which combined qualitative ethnographic interviews with biomarker collection among trans people. And he's currently a co-PI on the Trans Resilience and Health in Sociopolitical Contexts. The postcards are part of that project, which is a multi-sided longitudinal project aimed at understanding resilience and health among trans people in their sociopolitical climates. And it's based in the US across various states. Zachary's work is at the forefront of thinking about gender, sex, embodiment, and health. Today, he'll be talking about embodied inequality and gender sex diversity, challenging binary concepts as harmful social determinants of health. Please join me in welcoming Zachary to SHESC.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you all. I'm not Mike, so I have a tendency to not quite get there. So if you can't hear me, please do this and I'll speak out. Is this all right now? Excellent, thank you. So I'm really looking forward to talking with you all today, and I want to warn you, it's been a long time since I've stood in front of people in person. This is literally the first time that I've done this since COVID, so it feels a little surreal. Bear with me with the rusty parts. I'm sure we'll meet them together. Today I'm also going to be digging into some pretty complex concepts. Gender and sex are obviously not the simplest things to get into. And when we think about collecting data and doing research and engaging these ideas, we are all coming at this from a different place, and it kind of sounds like we might get to where we are, not necessarily where we're kind of starting from with this. So I just want to encourage looking at the confusion. I'll try to elaborate. You can decide and go. I have no problem being interrupted, or you can just kind of note your confusion and we can circle back. I'm going to just start with this roadmap. So here I'm going to just talk you through what I'll be trying to cover today. So here I'm going to start by just laying out the problem, really focusing initially on what I consider to be an issue of over-reliance on binary categorization of gender and sex, in order to really get into a discussion about how we identify the diversity of the ways. And I'm particularly invested in thinking about how we can do this in a way that actually promotes social justice. Clearly, our methods are related to our overarching framework that we use that guide our research. And so I also want to share some work from a number of really feminist scientists and scholars who are cutting edge trying to think through how to expand our thinking. So I'm going to be sharing some of those today, really focused on gender, sex entanglement, sex contextualism, and this concept of biological normalcy that we are familiar with. And that will really be important to discuss how binary constructs can really act as simple traits. And finally, to get at this question on why this matters, I'm going to draw on examples from my own research. This will be very eloquently and very synthetic for me, introducing those two projects. So I'll be speaking to both of them as examples to draw on to really talk about the experience of trans and gender diverse people here in the United States and how these are social changes in health this year. Some of you likely recognize this image. This is from Scientific American 2018. And many of us use this article in the courses that we teach for undergrads and what science to get at human variation and the complexity of sex-linked biologies. And as the title suggests, the idea of two sexes is overly simplistic. I like this article because it's really clear for a lay audience, why this is more complex and really challenges from the perspective of biology, of the binary idea and recognize the larger spectrum beyond that binary. But now we're kind of in a desperate moment for data collection at a global level for to understand really what diversity of gender experience looks like. As anthropologists, I think we should be able to kind of edge of that. We're not currently, in my opinion. There's a lot more that we can be doing than we have done more recently. I think historically we've done better than we are right now. So I'm hoping that my talk can sort of push that button forward a little bit and really think about how we can capture this complexity more effectively in our practice. And as I said, I really guess at this point, we've all seen years of headline news making this issue of gender, sex, categorization, fairness, and staff. So, for example, dehumanizing testing and examination of athletes in the name of enforcing these normalizing binary categories of male and female. And now I see this example in particular as really about the regulation of bodies of women and girls in sports, particularly targeting women of color. And this example is really helpful because it lets us see so clearly how to enforce these normalizing categories requires us to define them in very specific ways. And then to develop those boundaries also requires criteria of inclusion and exclusion that are then enforced. And so when we think about this example, the second headline shows how much testosterone is too much for a female athlete is really drawing a very clear line about what the boundaries look like. Data from colleagues in anthropology is really useful here. So we are arguably the experts on human biological variation. We're particularly skilled at researching dynamic systems within sociocultural, ecological, and environmental contexts. And thanks to our work, we already know so much about nature and intra-group variation. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the data I'm sharing here. But when we look at hormonal variation in behavioral and cultural contexts, we can really see how contingent this whole notion of normal and normal levels really is. And so here, continuing with this example of testosterone, on the left, we see variation in T levels among fathers in relation to the parenting role, so social endocrinology. And on the right, there's variation in T levels in different populations around the world. This kind of data, along with that of others, including Sally Van Anders, whose work is also in social endocrinology, really underlines this misinterpretation of testosterone levels through a static or universal. Nonetheless, we're clearly seeing escalating debates and political polarization. So now, in addition to debates about intersex bodies and Olympic sports, we're seeing polarizing policies about transgender athletes that are hinging on definitions of who is recognized and allowed to compete as a woman or a girl. And in the US, there are now statewide bans on trans athletes competing in youth or high school sports. And for some, this reflects an interest in bounding what I consider to be a relatively narrow idea of what it means. It's an idea that's being protected. More broadly, this really reflects a societal challenge to understand diversity of sex, gender, and gender identity, among other things. If you go down the path of sexual orientation, gender expression, and blah. So here it makes sense to touch base on terms, gender and sex, and how I'm going to be using them or have been using them. I'm going to return to complicate these in a minute. So generally, gender is used to represent lived experiences. It's socially constructed in the sense that it's produced and understood through interactions and sociocultural contexts, with norms that are ascribed in ways that affect how we all organize ourselves and interact with society. It's also recognized increasingly as fluid, especially when it comes to gender identity and expression. Making confusing, unfortunately, many people use these terms interchangeably. You don't always exactly know who's meaning what when they say them or that term. But the initial separation of gender and sex was really useful because it challenged biological essentials and the boundaries so much as I could. Second, in this framework reflects the biologicals, and usually this is considered to be aspects of reproductive biology, gonads, genitals, but also genes, hormonal milieu, and secondary sex behaviors. So though we know that sex and biologies are dynamic, that they impact environmental context and social life, generally this is seen as a kind of a bedrock for gender that gender sits on top of, so it's considered to be more static. It's also lived, but it is in fact assigned at birth, based on external genitalia. Currently, it's this concept of sex, in my opinion, that is still most in need of theorizing and further development and research. Although, the regulating measures for that. Dividing sex and gender categories is clearly central to how we currently organize ourselves and interact with one another, transmitting in many ways. And it's not necessarily wrong or ineffective to deal with binary, especially because it's not an all or nothing game. But binary categories don't enable us to always explain the differences that we might observe or tell us about the mechanisms or pathways that make those differences move. So whether we're looking at growth and development, sleep, BMI, or hormones, we are often uncritically reliant on the categories, and these can lead to misinterpretation, and they can actually hide what we're actually trying to understand or look for. Categorical thinking can negatively also affect our data collection. In the bottom right example, this is showing you what is often misleadingly called sex hormones, right? We all know why that's not quite accurate. Both males and females have testosterone and estrogen. However, estradiol is often collected best among men, testosterone is often collected best among women, except of course in examples that I shared earlier when the job is to actually try to identify abnormalities, right? To enforce these categories. Our findings can then also be used in a way that we may or may not intend. This can be reinforcing fixations that already exist on biological essentialist and static interpretations of male and female. So when should we conduct comparisons based on binary categories of gender or sex? This is actually a super simple question. I'm going to try to answer it all in the right? But it's really complex and it's an important issue. So this headline here, for example, is pointing to a very real problem of erasure of women in health research. Doctors must dig into gender differences to improve women's health. But on the other hand, others argue that focusing on differences between the sexes is leading medical researchers astray. And so this is pointing to the problem of attributing difference in rates of medication clearance, in this case of the sleep aid zolpidem, which is Ambien. It's attributing the difference to differences that are inherent, biologically inherent to the categories of male and female. And this has clinical implications for dosage that in the end don't actually reflect the science. It's a really powerful example because upon further analysis, what was uncovered is that while women do actually clear Ambien more slowly than men, the mechanism really had more to do with body size. And it wasn't so much just clean category of male and female. So this isn't really a case for never conducting group level comparisons, but instead being explicit about what work the category experiences do. So what do you think male and female are actually reflecting issues of sex and biologies for gender issues? To tackle some of these really relatively easy to remedy issues, beyond making hypotheses and methods more explicit, we can address some of the missed opportunities with our data collection that are particularly important given the very real need to collect data about gender identity and experience around the world that I mentioned earlier. So here I'm showing you some examples. I'm going to talk through these. So often we assume that people are cisgender, sort of our norm starting place. And that means that we assume that people's identities align with their sex. We also assume that people are straight or heterosexual in many cases. And this is particularly true when people look a certain way. So when they look what we consider to be gender normative, so meaning that the appearance of a person matches this binary expectation, whatever society or culture. This also happens when we're physically in places in the world where gender and sexual diversity are discouraged, right? Environmentally discouraged, very determined. I've talked about colleagues in the past, looking to share with people who are learning about gender diversity with experience. We don't have XYZ, or trans people aren't in that, because they're not visible. We're not visible in the same way. So this is a real problem. And in reality, we have no idea who our study participants actually are much of the time because we don't ask. And I'm not trying to minimize the complexity there of what asking means, right? So data about gender and gender identity for the most part is collected outside of research that's focused specifically on gender marginalization. So trans and non-binary. The examples here show surveys that are asking only about sex. So this is presumably reflecting sex assigned at birth. This may or may not actually align with someone's gender identity or their gender. The second example shows conflation of gender and sex. So we're asking about gender, the options to be divided or again, accept. The options to select man and woman, transgender, non-binary, or other options for gender are not provided, and so there's a lack of clarity about what these terms even actually mean. And I should just back up and tell you, when I put citations here, this is a copy of mostly feminist science and technology studies folks, a lot of neuroscientists who are making deep interventions in different fields. So I'm pointing to a resource that's useful too. So really this presents to us an opportunity for enhanced inclusive data collection and to expand what we already know, which is that gender is diverse. So here's an example from Canadian health researchers led by Greta Bauer that some of you may be familiar with her work. This is research focused on transgender health in North America. She does phenomenal work developing quantitative methodologies to conduct intersectional analyses. And this example is what's referred to as the two-part question. And that's because the first two questions enable recognition of people who are not cisgender by first asking about assigned sex at birth and then second asking about gender identity. Some issues with the wording in here where we can see that male and male and woman and female, these actually should be separated out for the connecting the identities in the wrong way. There should be a select all, apply kind of option, a write-in option. The third question can be useful for considering lived gender experience and gender expression, which might also differ from someone's gender identity. And the terms and wording, of course, would need to be continuously updated. They need to be informed by local communities, ideally, and they need to reflect the linguistic and cultural context of the Building on this in our design and our analyses and drawing on recommendations such as these good practice guidelines for research among gender sector and human health. And I think these 5 points are really, really clear. I'm going to just walk through them. So one of them is to be more explicit in what we're trying to learn. So really fully define our outcomes and independent measures for priority. The second, specifically more clear, specify more clearly the potential mechanisms instead of or in addition to looking at differences between community groups, often start from an hypothesis of difference, and then we find it. And sometimes we're curious, and particularly in biology, we're curious to know why, and so we'll have to do that work. And imagine if we flipped the script on that and instead said we wonder if there's similarity, we wonder if there's difference. Our hypotheses reflect the mechanism that we can drive that, and we test that. Then we can see if that actually matches onto these groups, right? So just sort of do it in the other order. It's not throwing the whole baby out with the bathwater, but just being more cognizant of the process. So more often than not, we're developing and often testing these mechanisms anyway. So just reframing these analyses and presentations that we get. We also already collect data and analyze. We collect and analyze social and biosocial data to varying degrees in our work to test our alternative hypotheses. So these recommendations here already align with our disciplinary needs and testing and experience from a more holistic perspective. And finally, to test biological and social mechanisms together really speaks to a biocultural approach as well. So some of these recommendations are included in a paper that I was able to publish, and it was an awesome experience thinking with another biocultural anthropologist and human biologist, Heather Shattuck-Einhorn. This came out last year in the American Journal of Human Biology, and in this we really try to unpack a lot of these arguments and issues that I'm talking through today. So really building on understandings of gender sex entanglement, challenging the way that binary categories are used, detailing some examples of the problematic alliance and use of groupings to represent typical biology as a real issue, and documenting the ways binary norms can reinforce stigma and inequality regarding gender sex identity and sexuality. Back to my roadmap, given these critical issues, how might we expand our frameworks to include gender sex entanglement, and how can the concepts of biological normalcy help clarify how the binary constructs affect social experience? One way is to reconsider how we're engaging the categories of gender and sex themselves, and how we might include recognition of how they interact with one another. So this means modifying our frameworks to better reflect this kind of entanglement, but also the context that we're working in. So increasingly in terms of our frameworks, scholars like myself are suggesting the use of this combined term, gender sex. So sometimes there's a slash, sometimes there's an asterisk. And this is really to flag that we're thinking this way, right? I think there might be also a tendency to want to use that as though it's doing something. So it's not, it's saying, I'm doing something when I use that term. And so that means you've got to do the work up front to think about how you actually engage both sides of this coin. It's really, there's no words to talk about something when it's a coin, it's always two things, but they're really always like this, right? So the term can't replace a framework any more than a list of marginalized identities can replace an intersectional approach or analysis. So you have to really recognize it for what it is and it's between. But it's really useful to think with, and it's really useful to write with, and it does mean something to think about. You know, there's debates about should sex come first or gender. Like, this is a very rich area to read and write right now. So I encourage people to delve into that literature if it's of interest to you. But really what we're trying to do is acknowledge that our biologies, in our biologies, we embody our social-cultural experiences, and that our social-cultural experiences are responsive to and interact with. So that's what I'm trying to do. So there's a lot of examples, particularly when you think about COVID. There's a lot of data initially. Remember in early days when we might have been prescribed estrogen or testosterone as a cure or a fix for COVID, when there was the observation that men were dying and women were dying less, or enduring less severe forms of COVID, right? And then wave after wave, it immediately went to the home. Like, oh, that's what it must be, right? There is discussion of prescribing that. Now, there's some biological basis to think about actions like the hormones and the immune system and inflammation. It's not that that's totally wrong, but to have it go straight there and not consider things like where are people working, what's their exposure, that's when it needs to take as exercise. The title of these papers here also showing a range of topics that are real contributions in this area that I was pointing to earlier. Really coming from scholars primarily in science studies, neuroscience, and psychology, who've been really interested. This third paper in particular, the sex contextualism paper, it's such a great interesting. It might be particularly useful for the human biologists in the room and the biological anthropologists in the room. This is another framework brought to us by Sarah Richardson, who is the director of the Gender Sci Lab at Harvard. This piece blows my mind. I think it's just really powerful and very helpful to break apart the idea that sex is a single. So instead, recognizing that it's actually a proxy, right? It's a categorical proxy for a whole number of things, all that are dynamic, all that vary, none of which are really captured by the one word sex. And so people are usually referring to some component, right? Whether that's hormonal, chromosomal, gonadal, or it might be gender. And so in this paper, she's really describing contextualism to mean we need to understand the context of why we're talking about sex and provide some real guidance to think about, for a number of really basic examples of animal models of the dynamism of sex, and how to really think about your own work in a way that says, what is my context? What part of this concept am I interested in? So in addition to expanding our ways of conceptualizing entanglement, sex contextualism, this model of biological normalcy, this is the one I know people are very familiar with, at least on BioAnt, really focused on this PhD a million years ago or 2 years ago. This was developed and elaborated by Andrea Wiley, and it's really useful for understanding how binary categories of gender and sex act as social determinants of health. For those who are unfamiliar or less familiar, the model is a circular one. It allows us to do the relationship between particular norms and normative views. So how cultural norms influence how we do science, and then how the statistical distributions and the biological traits that we study scientifically are then leveraged to reinform and inform those same cultural norms. So it's really circular, and it has a clear pathway with this example of testosterone, where we don't actually have the right data or sufficient data to make the claims around norms that we're making politically in these contexts around the body and normalizing categories on the one hand. On the other, there's a reliance on biological science around what we think testosterone is, what it does, what it means. That's constantly distributed. So the model is describing an obvious dynamic relationship. What I really love about it, though, is that it gives us as scientists and scholars a pathway in to have a meaningful contribution, right? It can sometimes feel like what we do is so abstract and we're writing papers, we're going to peer review, or that's in a journal somewhere, but this kind of dynamism, this area really makes it clear that this is the opposite of its, right? That our scientific contributions can be very healthy transforming. Now I want to get a little more into why this matters, who it harms. So I want to start by acknowledging that this matters because we're the binary category of social determinants of health, and that means for all people. It's not just gender and sexual minority or marginalized people. Cisgender, gender normal people are also restricted by limitations, facing scrutiny, judgment, potential stigma, potential harm, body distress, all of the things. There's lots of feminist work on this. That's really truly meaningful. My research and the lens that I come to this work with focuses on the health consequences of the body. And so as a transgender man myself, I'm someone who also conducts community-based research. And my research then focuses particularly on people who really challenge these discrete binary categories, whether they want to or not, in daily life. And so that's through accessing gender-affirming care, so socially or medically transitioning, people who live outside of what's perceived as these socially enforced norms, and people who are expanding or creating new categories and ways of being. I'm particularly interested in how people endure, resist, and thrive within and despite them. I think people probably know this. Trans and gender diverse people face stigma-based violence and discrimination. Data about the experiences and lives of trans and gender people shows this clear link between these rigid binary norms, stigma, and health. We've got dozens of surveys now that have found an alarmingly high rate of 41% of trans people in the US have attempted to commit suicide in their lifetime. And this is in large part driven by experiences of high rates of violence, harassment, lack of access to health resources, as well as increasingly high rates of homicide. There's a very rich history of trans people here in the United States. I'm not going to have time to go into that too much now, but I wanted to highlight and recommend reading any of the number of books. These are just three. I particularly encourage people to read books that are written by trans-identified scholars and historians. The three I'm showing you here really capture the struggle of trans people, which has been going on for generations. Many of the positive changes, or all of the positive changes that we're actually seeing now, are really on the backs of people who've given their lives through these struggles. And these are documented quite well in different ways in these three books. And there's more coming out. People probably know Susan Stryker. She's one of the more well known. So now we're going to discuss two studies, both of them mentioned in the introduction. So to sort of draw out what this has looked like. So over time, this makes me feel ancient. So I conducted two studies. The transition experience study was 2009 to 2012, was participation research. And this was a study where I conducted interviews and collected health measures with 65 transgender men in New England. So this meant all the participants in that study were accessing testosterone hormone therapy. That was one of the requirements to participate. And just a reminder that transition is a gender affirming process. That's why we refer to it as gender affirming care. It's therefore a key social determinant of health for trans people, which is why when we see have it on the chopping block in any state, it's real lives that are at risk, and it's being debated as though these are abstract policies instead of engaging with experts in medicine. So we're kind of a political football, obviously, at the moment. Backpedaling now to this time period. Many of us still refer to this as the Dark Ages. This is a period where the study was conducted, and at the time there was a lack of anti-discrimination gender identity behavioral diagnosis. Letters were required in order to access care. So you needed to go and get a lot of letters. You needed to get a diagnosis from a psychotherapist who brings a medical practitioner to access this care. So you go through all of that, and then you'd be denied any insurance coverage, right? Because it was for all of these problems, anti-trans or trans-inclusion insurance policies. So it's really horrible time when people cannot afford care at all, or they were traveling for care. And many endured what's called a real life test, which required trans people to socially transition for a year to private practice and management gender affirming care. That's obviously something that this is in the world of this country. In addition, there are challenges to changing identity documents. These reflected state-based definitions of what sex even is. This is a fascinating area on its own. Paisley Carruthers came out with a book that's called Sex Is as Sex Does. So if you're interested in that aspect, I recommend that book. Really the function of the category in a legal and sort of policy way and understand what it actually doing. So when you think about states, some states define sex based on chromosomes. So if you're in Texas, you can't change your birth certificate, you can't change your gender marker because you can't change your chromosomes. No medical note will get you do that. Other states, it's just show us a note that says you have possible. So there's a lot of variance in this application of this category in this way that trans people. The doctors were trained in gender-friendly care. There were fewer social media networks, and there's a lack of funding opportunities through the National Institute of Health because there hadn't been recognition yet that trans people occupy with the health disparities in the population until 2016. So people could write grants that really named the target audience, or the target population is trans people. This meant there's a lot more research done on, but not with, trans community. So the way that I'm approaching this as an anthropologist, I'm interested in understanding embodied stigma and health. We've obviously got the tools necessary to really dig in and understand the harmful effects that these kinds of stigma can have. So in my work, I combine survey, interview, ethnographic methods, and then I integrate in measures of psychosocial stress, mental health, and stress embodiment to understand the stress effects. Measuring things to understand how static loads, so overall wear and tear on the body, as well as independent and understanding different systems and how they impact. And all of this can help us more understand health risks and risks. And one thing that's really key to remember with trans health is we've been fixated for what feels like on disparity in health risk and the fact that we don't know, so in the blank. But at this point, which we're starting to get to the point of thinking, well, we might actually get to age as a group. We might actually get to think about chronic disease. We might actually get to think about what it means to live a full life. So more and more, it's great that you can want. So many of us in the room know these kinds of minimally invasive biomarker collection methodology, sampling methods. So I draw on all of these in order to collect different kinds of samples. And what I want to highlight here is the relevance for this population is that these are all collected outside the clinical environment. So working with a population that's particularly stigmatized or has endured harm through medical establishments, we're able to go into people's homes, to go into the field, take a blood spot, ask folks to collect their own saliva sample, wear a 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure monitor that is not pursued in my sample. That looks really comfy. I don't feel that well. That compensates every 15 minutes while they're waking every 30 minutes in their sleep. Where I set it up, and people do it. People did all these things because they want the data, but a lot of people would not do this in a clinical environment. So it's really another thing that the doctors and pathologists. And never mind on volunteers, point of care devices are really bad for that. So through the interviews, I was able to identify a number of what are called minority stressors. The problems with that term. We're starting shifting that to marginalization stressors. A lot of us in trans health are working in this area because it's really literally about learning what people are enduring. What do we call that? How do we identify it? How do we provide supports and things like that? And so first phase of my research is really identifying those types of things through that interviews and then trying to assess the experience of those things in relation to something. So here I'm just showing you one. So 22% of the sample experienced misgendering. That's a chronic stressor. You can think about it as the opposite of being gender affirming. We can talk about that if we need to here or want to. But for those who reported experiencing misgendering on a regular, they had significantly higher C-reactive protein and inflammation levels compared to those who did not. And that's a really cut and dry. This is a cross section, not longitudinal, but it was so stark. This is a really important finding. Lisa Diamond just came out with a paper about inflammation recently that I think is excellent because it's really sharing how thinking about inflammation as a real marker of risk for health disparity is key, and really thinking about chronic disease. Obviously, inflammation is really important. So this really speaks to the way that people are treated socially, right? And one that we just kind of pushed. So here I'm showing you another set of images with different biomarkers. So here this is cellular protocol. related to marginalization, stress of 4 things. So I'm going to talk you through it. It's a little bit smaller in the writing. So what you're seeing here is significantly in waking cortisol levels. So that's the first step. There were 5 samples taken over the course of 1 day for 3 days and then average. So when you look at one of these, that's a normal curve. You want the cortisol to go up when you wake, go up again 30 minutes later, and then go down. So this is normal, right? With that shape is. What is notable though is the difference between those 2 lines. There is higher for folks who are experiencing these particular stressors upon waking, and then 30 minutes later, called cortisol waking. And that's relevant, and I interpret that to reflect an anticipatory state. So I know this morning, you might have my cortisol, and we'll do this talk today. I thought we didn't really have cortisol, that makes sense. So anticipation can be very positive and motivating, but it can also be chronic and devastating if it's happening to you every day, where you're anticipating things like, so on the left, transition identity stress, that's referring to this really simple concept of when you transition, you change your name, you shift your pronoun, you tell people about that, and then you're walking around in your life and you see your friend from a decade ago who doesn't know, and you're at work with people who've always only known you as the trans person that you are, and you're in this juggling mode. So it's super stressful. That further that is transition identity stress. It's not everybody's experience. It's literally like 45% of the sample reported experiencing that, and they have higher rating than waking cortisol and higher cortisol. This next one is stress about coming out. That's trans. Bottom left is stress about using gender-specific other questions. And then here on the right is showing how validated general scales are ineffective at capturing this stress. This is a perceived measure, and there's an epidemic capturing. So even though that's really old data, there's still a lot to be learned from it because it collected so much data. Graduate students in the room, ask your mentors, is this a career or is this a dissertation? A lot, and better for worse. What it does, is I was able to publish a paper with a colleague, Bob Schuster, and it's still 2022, isn't it? Yeah, that just came out. I'm really proud of this paper because you know how you do these really intensive interviews and collect all this data, like how will I ever use all of it? So for this, what we did is we indexed everything that's in the interviews and developed these categories of experience. We ordered it then at allostatic load. So taking all of those biomarkers and developing an index of those to see the overall wear and tear across multiple systems. And so these are the systems from the HPA, endocrine, cardiovascular, and metabolic systems. So taking these different measures and then looking at them together to understand is that person as an individual enduring a high level of allostatic load that where I'm using this, that's all I can take. This is all based on the Levering hypothesis, and Geronimo is where you're moving right now. Indexing that lived experience was also an opportunity to go through those interviews, the survey, and really think about all the different categories of people's lives and what might be impacting allostatic load. And what's really deep is what we found is that for folks who perceive living less progressive geopolitical climate and have less sociodemographic advantage, they get higher allostatic. And this was really, it aligns with the historic moment that we live in, right? To see sort of the impact of what a political climate can do on one's health and well-being. And it's really inspired a lot of the work that I'll be talking about. Because now time moves forward. So we're still in 2012. So now Zoom, well, not really Zoom, I can say that about these technologies, but so I completed data collection and then the world, has been changing ever since, right? So here I'm just showing you some images from media to show some other powerful and positive ways that the world has changed. So you've seen a distinct rise in positive representation of trans people in media and culture. The emergence of shows that are featuring relatively positive interpretations of trans experience, sometimes centering trans characters, though in early days these are not usually played by trans actors. That's changed and is changing. So more recently, there's been increased visibility of public representation, particularly trans people of color, in shows and documentaries, including Pose and Exposure, which I work in both, and then achievements in sports, as well as political representation. We've seen a lot of trans people running in the most recent winter. Then up until 2016, we've really seen some significant advances in access and protections, particularly during the Obama administration. These included anti-discrimination legislation, for instance, expanding definitions of federal guidelines to include gender, advances in healthcare access, advancing trans people's ability to travel, changing their documents, and living our lives in the city. I live in Oregon. That's pretty cool. Really cool. At least the identity document side of things. But unfortunately, the tide has really turned, and we are experiencing significant backlash, a rise in anti-trans bills, particularly in the past 3 to 5 years. These measures target non-binary people for discrimination, such as by barring access to criminalizing the use of appropriate facilities, including restrooms, restricting trans students' ability to fully participate in sports, barring healthcare for trans youth. This is a huge area. And then making it more difficult for trans people to get identification documents that they're going to get them. So we're really kind of very close to that. So positive visibility has not yet necessarily translated to the reductions in stigma and discrimination, harassment, and violence that we would hope. An example that highlights how interpersonal discrimination and stigma become institutionalized is reflected in the news to criminalize the use of genitals in public restrooms that don't correspond with someone's statuses at birth. I love calling this the nonsense of anti-trans bathroom bills. It really is. When you look at this example, it's shrouded in propaganda, these scare tactics that are suggesting that all trans people are actually cisgender men dressed as women in order to enlist in women's clothing in order to then do harm, particularly to women and children. But in reality, trans people are actually the victims, not the perpetrators in this case, and these campaigns are worse than that. And here on the right, we're seeing the We Just Have to Pee campaign, which was an awesome campaign that came out at that time. And it really shows how ludicrous these bills really are, because that what they result in is trans men like myself being required to use the women's restroom, right? So that's just rare. It's just bogus. And that's because of this female sex segregation at birth. So these types of debates and policy theory reflect some of the confusion and harm there's strict binary compared to the. So what do we do? This is now something in my current project. I'm working with Jay Public, who's my primary collaborator. He's a clinical psychologist at Michigan State University. We launched this project, the Trans Resilience and Health and Sociopolitical Concepts, actually a mouthful study. Prior to the pandemic, it's a study of how place and sociopolitical events relate to health and resilience for trans individuals. So this is a more diverse sample than my first project. It was inclusive of trans masses, trans feminine, non-binary people. This is to avoid this because I say I identify as independent. And as you can see in the map image, we're looking in 4 states: this is Oregon, Michigan, Nebraska, and Tennessee. The numbers there are showing the sample size for each state. And Jay and I pulled our startup funds because we wanted to launch this project in the midst of all of that, because we were feeling so beaten down by it. We wanted to do something positive. So it felt really good to come together and launch this thing. It's the biggest thing I've done so far, to try to do a multi-sided thing with all kinds of people. I mean, this just to show you, this is the let's acknowledge people first slide. These are all of the students and faculty that are helping collect data and work with the data. So this weekly is here, one of our primary collaborators, Jay. Among many other people. This is Jay and me. I think telling that is now my profile and everything.
Yeah.
Professional photos. But yeah, we've been working with faculty and other folks in these different places, and this is the timeline here. So it launched in fall of 2019. We luckily were able to get our interviews done, almost all of them, before COVID shutdown. So that's why we aimed for like 45 in each state. We got close to that with our 158 total participants. So we did these interviews. We did a lot of biomarkers, so we collected salivary cortisol, blood pressure with single levels, not for 24 hours, and too many blood spot for C-reactive protein, and then that's evidence. We got all that done. So it shuts us down right here. Luckily, we already designed the project to have surveys for a year. So it meant that we are now, we're able to have that. It was a lot to maintain, but we didn't have to alter our entire research design, and we weren't shut down. We did have to push out our final round of interviews. We did those on Zoom. And then we got to travel around states again and collect biometric again. And because we were doing all of that, this is an example of the flyer on the left. and this is us training the teams. Jay and I actually traveled to each of those sites on the front end. Started working with a bunch of psychologists who were really brilliant about trans health and not a single one of them ever corrected a biomarker. Oh, they're capable of talking about anything. I mean, anything. Things that I can't talk about like in a personal way. Like, but when we went to do a blood spot or to measure, there was this real cultural difference in terms of comfort with the body. So it's fascinating how we have that in its own. So we traveled around and trained these teams to collect this data. Because there is a different way to think when you're trying to actually be conscientious around people's gender experience, whether you're saying, hey, can I measure your waist to hip ratio? Right? Let's target the part of your body that you're struggling with the most. How can we do that in a way that isn't like clinically objective, but being a human being, you know? So we had a lot of great conversations. This is just showing you our spit samples. That's Jay Wavy driving around collecting data, and that's us in Tennessee doing our biomarker approach. So really, you know, positive, challenging experience to these projects. For motivation, I don't think I need to elaborate too much further, but I just bring these up just to show none of this has stopped. It's going on and on to for the individuals in 2022. We all know about the attack in Colorado Springs, and there's no distancing the rhetoric in this perspective around binaries and how to enforce them from the actual actions that people are taking politically, whether that's through voting or through violence. We selected the states that we collected data in large part because of what you see here, which is variation in terms of the kinds of protections that are in place in those states. So years ago, that's Oregon, and it's Trans Mecca, and there's a lot of protections. It doesn't make it perfect states. Seriously white, there's a lot of struggles in that state of inequality. However, for trans people, there's excellent health, there's access to care at all. And then there's protections. Whereas if you have that in Nebraska, Tennessee, and it's just that doesn't mean though that we know what's going on the ground, right? We don't necessarily look at Tennessee and say, "Oh, it must be horrible to be trans there," right? That's what we didn't want to buy into. We wanted to go something. And so this is our sample. It's super numbers like the thing for you. But I'm here just showing you some of the implementation of some of those ways of collecting data about gender identity can enable you to actually get some really interesting data, right? And this is just in the States where when we ask people how to identify, that's what we get. When we do collapse sometimes, we're still binning, we're still categorizing people. I'm binning them into 3 instead of 2 categories. It's not cis and trans, but it's trans masc, or trans men, trans feminine, trans women, non-binary, right? So we're still doing a thing, but we've got to be conscious as to why. There's hypotheses that drive that, and we're not doing all of our analyses by gender identity, right? We also try to diversify based on age. So if you look in the far left, we're really aiming to have representation from older people who are often left out of the research, as well as rural people. And we were aiming for a 50-50 split for people of color and white participants, and did well in some states more so than others, you can see. And it was very, very challenging. The most challenging was to actually get rural participants. We only like 16%. And we tried very hard for that. So just briefly, a couple of the things that we're learning. So where we're at now is data analysis and starting to write. So this figure is from the recent non-paper canal on trans health. It's focused on mental health experiences in relation to perceptions that people have in their conversations with the conversation. And so this figure is showing some of those gender marginalization stressors that I started to share earlier. So if you look down that list, they're pretty straightforward. I'm just circling the ones that were the bars, right? That's all that is reflecting. But overall, we're looking at measurements that do live in the more conservative states. You're probably not surprised here and have perceived those places as more negative about trans people at the local level. But what we're kind of sad to learn is that there's really no change, no difference. Doesn't matter where you live, the perception of views of what's going on at the national level will all be consistent about negative factors. There's a lot of data already supporting the impact of there were no state-based differences in self-reported health, so we see that as being negative concepts of all is really driving. So the lives of people that we're talking to are evidently really impacted by these stressors, regardless of the locations that they live in, and coping and resilience levels, which we measured, are also. So this is just papers that I was mentioning that are coming out of things. We're also targeting a few that are specific to therapy. Jay and their team are therapists, and so they're trying to make interventions in that field directly. And I hope that I was able to boost your mental health a little bit and swag that you're getting. One of the projects that's emerging through this is during the baseline interviews, we actually asked people to tell us what they define resilient, what it means to be in their life. Or we got to say to you for including I think that one. That was a point was kind of reading in my election was talking about thriving, but then we had people using all kinds of metaphors to describe what resilience really looked like in their minds and in their hearts. And what we did was we have selected some of those. The cards that you have are those quotes. And trans artist Zach Fisherman, so they're working at subconscious.com. It's also on the back of the card. They took these quotes and developed these images, put them on the postcards. Shape on this trans resilience postcard project, and we're really hoping that these can be distributed and shared in meaningful ways, whether that's letter writing campaigns or sharing them with people who need that support. And so if you put this, that's horrible. That is a foreign issue. I can't do it in this. That one should move over here, right? So there's five of them total. You'll get to see them all if you have them. If you want one, all you need to do is go to transresiliencestudy.com and there's a button you can push. You can just say I'd like X number and you will mail them to me free of charge. And if you do that, I also don't want to leave your phone, so I really want to encourage all of you to take a lot and share them with people and whatever way that you want to consider. That is it. Yeah, there's also a thank you right there. But thank you.
Like to open it up for questions. I'm supposed to do something or not. So wonderful talk, Zach, as per always, just really fascinating stuff. Can we I have so many questions, but I'm not gonna, we'll do this again. But can I ask you to talk to us a little bit about recruitment? Particularly in the spaces where it might be dangerous to reveal personal information like this, even though they understand that you are trans folks doing this research, but that like it might not be safe. So how are you handling that in like Nebraska, Tennessee, spaces where folks legally don't have protections in the same way?
You mean like how are we trying to get through that barrier?
Yeah, like to get folks to feel comfortable participating in the study.
Yeah, I mean, you're right to point with that we had to be very, very out about who we are and explicit about what our feelings are in terms of that. I think there's a lot of work that is about maybe long-term health and perspectives that Rob and Helen isn't compelling violence, for instance. Also that we were coming to them. There was not a you come to me, and that we will meet you at your safe place, or we'll create one for you. So a lot of the recruitment just meant time, to be quite honest, where we had the budget and things like, although we had that team, for instance, a lot of the queries that came from people who were maybe interested came to me or Jay directly what I would be on the phone. And it would be just time on the phone talking to people and explaining why we're doing this, what we're doing, what we're doing, the participation. Just a lot of the detailed conversation. And people are very sophisticated in understanding the risks, not just to their own bodies and lives in terms of the discrimination, but what have you, but through the data. Right, so we asked for people to sign consent forms for the team and there are environmental issues. And people are like, right, all of those conversations also. So beyond trans, when we happen to be working here, it's kind of consent forms because she can also have access to data that we need. So it was just this common conversation. People see this as oh, Zoom actually a lot to have that face time. And I think it was another partnering with communities about that, like community organizations on the ground. We did less though on that in Tennessee and Nebraska because we didn't know what Jane had so I just to have the solutions first. So that we can listen back with organizations. We have that in order to have that in class. Yeah, community life.
Yeah, yeah.
If you were first, then
You want to
Thank you so much for this talk. I'm wondering if you've noticed differences in terms of the categories of people's senses of safety or their concerns for people across the gender spectrum. So if someone is trans masc, trans femme, if someone is non-binary and that means androgynous, or if someone is non-binary and that means on some days I feel more one or the other, or this, separate category, if across those different experience lines, there are differences in terms of what people are noticing or what people have access to.
do you notice in terms of their experiences that we're sharing with us?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely there's variation, and sometimes I am inclined, and we all are, to use the category again as an explanatory. So I try to resist it because it's not always the reason. There's a lot of individual variation. It's just the people, right? So I try to pause, but yes, and a paper that Cindy and I have been working on soon, for next episode, is focused on masculine experience, probably is most illustrative of what you're describing, I think, where we learned from people in really short answer form. And we didn't even ask specifically about what's your experience with masculine, but we heard about it through these monthly surveys. There is variation in terms of gender identity, in terms of misgendering experience, for instance, moving around in the world with half of your face covered. And there's some literature about why, referring to how we move faces and proximity face matter and things like that. Also, voice matters in that regard. And so certainly we're seeing, for instance, increased misgendering experience by for transmasculine people and non-binary people, and less so for people who identify as transgender or transfeminine. So that would be kind of start identity-based, arguably gender presentation-based.
So kind of piggybacking off of like categorical flexibility, in your experience, especially within the biological sciences and trans individuals, do you see a lot of like Truscom like ideology and philosophy, and how do you think that impacts the work versus something that's a bit more gender fluid?
Do you want to say what true summer is?
I'll let an expert,
We should be referring to the position of biological essentialism that's held by many trans people, as well as non-trans people, who are used, for instance, that you always are with the listening. And some people that are trans come to understand their own identities through a path that says, well, my biology is wrong, I need to fix it. So I'm going to access medical affirmative care and I'm going to fix it. My brain is male. I'm referring to myself here if I have the perspective. My brain is male. I can brain sperm, I can do whatever, and men are men, women are women. Non-binary is really a problematic category for this group of people. That's sort of a made-up identity. They're very disrespectful, and there's a lot of Twitter about this. It's awful and because it's divisive, it's not really constructive. So that's what the term is. Now, can you tell me your question again?
How especially within the biological sciences, when we see like neurobiology, like you have a man brain, so you are transitioning to a man. How this kind of essentialized ideology compares to things of gender fluidity, and how maybe you collect data, or how if you're working with other trans biologists, if you've encountered a lot of biological essentialism within transgender biological studies, I guess.
I'll try.
Sorry, that was very clear.
I'm getting it later.
Yeah.
So yes, there is a lot of essentialism in trans health research. And yes, trans people have been accessed as a population to ask questions that are about binary sex, because we're seen as a witness test, right? So you can ask, oh, well, if brains are girl brains or boy brains, if you had T, does it turn into a girl brain, or was it a girl brain or a boy brain? And which one is most real? It's all Pinocchio, right? So like, what's the real natural state, and how does it change? And so if we remove power and we remove politics and we remove inequality, which we can't, but if we could, these questions might actually be interesting on a biological level. Like, ooh, how do bodies work? What's going on? What changes when we push this? What changes when we push that? And so I think that people maybe think sincerely, initially at some point, that they can ask those questions in ways that are neutral. Unfortunately, we can't. And so unfortunately, what actually happens is you're always reinforcing some political framework, and that's why it's you know, it's a real thing that you need to acknowledge those going into the work. And I think one of the things that trans scholars bring in is the inability to accidentally ask a question without recognizing power. You know, it's like, no, you can't ask that. Sure, it's kind of interesting. Or maybe it even inform my decision. Oh yeah, I feel more true because whatever. But you don't necessarily write the grant to get the science because you're aware that it's more likely to do harm than good. And so I think one of the benefits of having more collaborative teams that are reflective of the communities we work with is it protects less kinds of community from scholars who maybe without intention would otherwise do harm by asking what they think would be objective science questions that are absolutely no objective. Is that?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Did I read the last data slide correctly or incorrectly? It looked like there was not a lot of difference across the, or maybe it was something you said as you were going through the slide. What was the difference across the states? Or was there not as much difference as you thought there were going to be, and really it was all okay?
Yeah,
Which
the difference
is
across the states.
interesting, but what's the implication of that politically? Because that's an interesting observation if you're saying that there's no direct correlation that we can show with these sort of state level policies. Well, I mean, they're different levels of analysis anyway, but like, how do you navigate through that as a finding, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah, so this, I would say two things. One, this is a small sample. This is a 1-year study, and it's not designed necessarily to get at structural level inequalities. There's a lot of different ways to do this. What we're using are the mapping projects, grading systems, and thinking about how these states are rated based on protections, right? So Tennessee is more conservative. So just to say this is a system that we can analyze that. The difference by state was by perception of individuals in the state. There was difference. So people in Tennessee did perceive Tennessee as more conservative. But yeah, you're right that what we're seeing in terms of the mental health effects and the impacts on coping and resilience, that we don't and aren't seeing state level differences with those. And our understanding is that that reflects this broader landscape and the importance of that. I'm very interested to see what we see when we look at the physiological health and well-being in terms of the cortisol, the individual measures, but also that allosteric bone, which we haven't done those analyses yet. I haven't even seen month-old data yet, but we're really early days in that. We might see variability there because one of the benefits I think using biological measures is what also able to see embodiment that might not be seen. So we might actually get at some things there, but mostly it also informs the need to have more states represented, longer term studies on the way that's.
Alice, do we have time for one more question? Of course. Oh, great. I was going to say very quickly, it's not even a question, and I think it also speaks to, and I think your work does this in general, a kind of pushing away from an idea that things, and we know this just from the laws that you cited, but this idea that things are getting better or life just gets easier, or if you just live in this place, you're not going to experience these bad things. And, you know, there might be these material effects, like you were saying in Oregon, that there's more access to healthcare. So you might see that in the kind of embodied response. But I think there's a kind of idealism from people who are outside of a marginalized group, but who have quote unquote good intentions, that things are just better in these spaces. And all we need to do is pass the laws and these folks will be okay. And I think your work speaks to the fact that it's much more complicated.
Amber.
I'm here.
I'll call on her next.
Hi. So in following what Alex was saying about sort of surprising patterning in this slide in particular, I think it's very notable that the stress around public restrooms appears to be higher than family rejection, right? And so because so many of us are interfacing with students who are transitioning, who are away from their support systems, and who are encountering the stress around public restrooms, I wondered if there was any empirical guidance on what professors and classmates who are interfacing with students experiencing this can do to support or buffer this stress.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question and an important question. I think we can do a lot, and I think it's not as hard as people think. I think that there's a sincere resistance from people who haven't experienced the thing. And this would be a general statement to take steps that might feel inconvenient. particularly when they challenge ways of thinking. So pronoun use was very, very challenging. You have how do you know that all the time you see gender and you say it's she, right? That's a very understandable challenge point. I think in our interactions with students in particular, it's important to be aware of that in ourselves. There's a number of different empirical based studies that are looking at what's effective to minimize experiences of marginalization, but also shift that culture. And some of it is let's all put our pronouns at the bottom of our signatures. That is a really helpful way just to say, hey, this shouldn't be an assumption people make, and it's not always the case. And you actually don't need to actually think about it at all. Ideally, so like normalizing, asking. There's also an argument against that, right? So not necessarily everyone wants that, not everyone. And so it is not always going to be a one size fits all, because there's also the reality, at least what I see in the classroom, is often they'll do the pronoun game. Yeah, you go around and say your name and your pronoun. Some people opt out and then they're binary gender. So you don't say it in he, she. Only people who say they say their pronouns, and that can be really stigmatizing, right? So I think just understanding and really reflecting on this, even if it's not really the experience, goes very far to being compassionate and trying to protect and make space. And I say protect because sometimes I think our job does need to be to say, hey, that just happened, let's have a conversation, or have a one-on-one with a student who you observe might be struggling, and providing some of that particular kind of familial connections are gone. So like providing some of that support. I think with bathrooms, it's advocating at an institutional level to make sure that there are spaces that are safe, that are actually places you can get to in the time period, between classes or what have you, not have to go from one building to another. It just always needs to be good from about everywhere else. But with the bathrooms. But making sure that it doesn't need to always be a single use gender neutral. It needs to be what the students in the room need, right? And so there's a lot of ways to get there from here, but trying to advocate for that. And I think doing things like on the first day, I think in the same way that we need to talk about food insecurity, because that's something that we're not engaging sufficiently with in the group. Just kind of all the things, what are the things students would need, and making sure, where the bathrooms are, just saying, normalizing, here's where that one is, here's where this one is. You don't need to ask permission to go, and modeling in terms of your own introduction to yourself. Those are just the kind of obvious and welcome other people to share if we found things useful.
And Mir.
Well, welcome to Arizona. I'm so happy that you accepted our invitation. My name is Amira Estrada, and I wanted to ask consejo and advice. I have a student who's doing a very interesting research in Spain, looking at trans communities, looking at citizens and also immigrants in an organization in Spain. She's Latina. And what advice would you give to someone who's not trans and doing research with this community? I think you've already kind of answered that. So she could be an insider with, regarding to her immigrant experience, being Latina, but an outsider where she doesn't identify as trans. What advice would you give to a student who's doing this type of research so it's ethical, and also that she's very mindful about her position and understanding this community? She has done research in her master's. I think she's really invested and careful about the way that she is approaching this community. But I would love to hear from you what additional advice you would have for
if a student is a cisgender student who is an ally and wants to do work with trans and diverse people, I usually ask them why. I'm curious. Like, I want to know what makes them invested in it. And I don't mean that as a negative challenge, but as a positive one. Learn from the student what they're enthusiastic about, because that's your starting point. And for some, it's social justice, right? It's self-exploration. I've had students who in the end are actually coming out. And then there are others who are just like wanting to really be ethnographers and understand lived experience and not wanting to do it in a way with other, right? So there's so much reasoning. I think it's helpful to hear from the student first, because I can sort of meet them there. With trans and gender diverse people, no matter where you are, I think the first thing you think our students do is try to read in this area specifically. A lot of people read broadly about gender, but they don't do the work to read about transgender in the place where they're going to be. There may be very little, there may be a lot, but read it. Try to do a really dedicated literature review, and do a trans 101 training, whatever training as an ally you can do, And I think that should kind of be a requirement. I think otherwise on the ground, it's really, I think it's very necessary to get into a community-based sort of research model. It doesn't necessarily need to be participatory action, but it should be community-based in the sense that if you are not a person from a community you want to work with, ideally you are getting more of getting some insights from design through dissemination from the community to make sure the questions you're asking right now and pushing curiosity can actually produce something good for the community itself. Because where you start from is not necessarily where the community is or where it needs, and you're bringing resources to that place, to that group, ideally. So what are your givebacks? What are your contributions? So usually that means trying to connect with an organization on the ground, doing some pilot interviews to learn what would be meaningful, and then framing your research to at least include that, if not have that be the guiding light. And ideally you have something like either focus groups or a community advisory board throughout the study, which you need money usually. And that's the only other thing is people often don't pay before compensating people.
Okay, thank you everyone for, there's a question behind me.
Did you find it as a trans person, talking about this kind of thing in non-LGBT environments, was there like a learning curve for you to sort of be more and more comfortable with it?
I think it probably started the opposite because I feel like I've always been this lost. But more frequently on not with other trans people than there. And so I never really felt uncomfortable with the first one that way. I don't know, maybe it's I'm just caught uncomfortable. It's possible, but it could have just been like, I love this part because I can see everyone's faces and hear their intentions and what they're interested in interests me. And I don't mind being asked questions like the wrong way. And anything like that, because I think it's like about and I love it. I think it's hard when there's conflict is really the challenge, right? Like the only time I've ever felt uncomfortable as a trans person talking to a predominantly cis audience is if there's overt hostility where I'm baiting. And you know that that's what that is. That makes me very uncomfortable because you don't want to give too much attention to it and have it dominate a thing, but you also don't want to not respond. So I think that's uncomfortable. But yeah, I haven't really thought too much about that. You just show up where you are and you do things that you're just gonna do it. You're not your own picture.
Can you join me in a round of applause?